Hello and welcome to the Patient Endurance Podcast, hosted by myself, Steve, and my brother in Christ, Dale. Last podcast, we stated our hermeneutics. We believe in a literal face value reading of the Bible. Further, we believe that the Bible does not contradict itself. So if there appears to be a conflict, then we need to dig deeper. We affirmed that there is a literal millennial kingdom and Jesus will return to rule it. We also went through watching. We are told to watch and are provided signs for Jesus' second coming. We are also told to live as if he could arrive at any minute. And our last key point stated that as the Bible narrative advances from Genesis to Revelation, there is only one story. Additional information is revealed, but it never contradicts.
In today's discussion, we're going to examine what the Gospels say about the end times. And the first thing we want to look at are questions from Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And these were questions about the destruction of the temple. Next, we're going to look at questions about when and why, and then we're going to look at Jesus' teaching about the end times. In Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, there's these questions about the destruction of the temple. And what's interesting is in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, his disciples are asking the questions. But in Luke 21, there's just people talking. They're in the temple area, and there's some people talking, and they were speaking about how grand the temple was. And Christ answers all three with the same statement. As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So what we have is one question followed by a very radical answer by Jesus. There's a bunch of confusion over these passages. And one of the things when I was looking at this that I kind of observed right away is, hey, Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are on the Mount of Olives, and they're privately with the disciples. Luke 21 is at the temple, and it's an open discussion with everyone around them. And that kind of like hit me as, wow, that's different. Another thing that happened was in Matthew 24, it's a little different in that they ask him privately, what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age? Mark 13 is similar to Luke 21 in what was asked. When will these things be and what will be the sign these things are about to be accomplished? But again, Luke 21 is at the temple with everyone around. So what we see here is there's really two answers. One was for the public and one is for the disciples with great details. Separate prophecies for different groups and different times.
So now we're going to read through Luke 21 and highlight the key points. Starting at verse 8 and going to verse 24 in the ESV version. And he said, see that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he. The time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place. But the end will not be at once. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famine and pestilence, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. There will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be delivered up even by parents and brothers, and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives.
Now, Steve, did you notice that? He talks about before all this. So apparently verses 12 through 19, which you just read, are actually before verses 8 through 11. That's interesting.
We'll have to come back and look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Going on from there, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the cities depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against the people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Now, isn't that interesting again? Until the time of the Gentiles are filled. And what's interesting to me, as I was reading this against Matthew 24, there's no reference to the abomination. It's when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Further, it's the days of vengeance to fulfill what is written. What are those?
I agree. It's almost like verses 12 to 24 were an insert in another discussion.
Exactly.
So the next thing we're going to do is look at a table we built, which align Matthew, Mark, and Luke for an easy comparison. And you'll see that in the slides we post online. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus is having a private conversation with his disciples discussing far future events. In Luke 21, it is a public conversation talking about near-term events and some far terms. On the first look, it appears like Luke 21 is exactly like Matthew 24 and Mark 13. But once we get to verse 12, it reverses the order of events. In verse 20, it's talking about Jerusalem surrounded by armies, but no mention of the abomination. A completely different narrative from Matthew and Mark. When we get to verse 24, it is clear this is not the tribulation period. It is the age of the Gentiles, as highlighted until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So from verse 12 to 24, we have this insert into the dialogue. By verse 25, we are back to the end times when it says the sun, moon, and the stars are darkened.
But this is exactly why people think it's fulfilled, because verses 12 through 24 are fulfilled. They're from the time of Jerusalem being destroyed in AD 70. If you take verse 12 through 24 out of Luke 21, it actually reads very similar to Matthew and Mark.
And things align very, very nicely when you do that.
So the times of the Gentiles, what exactly is that? Let's look at that a little closer here. In Romans 11, in verse 25, Paul talks about the time of the Gentiles, and he says, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So basically, Israel has been hardened partially to let us become believers. Then Christ will return, okay? And in verse 26, what it says, "And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them, and when I take away their sins. As regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their fathers." So what we see here is this matches exactly what is in Luke 21, verses 12 through 24. That's about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. It then skips to the return of Christ, whereas Matthew 24 and Mark 13 is to a different group, and that's on the Mount of Olives and is giving us great details about Christ's return. So let's look at Matthew 24 and Mark 13. We're going to examine this long-term prophecy of Jesus, and we're going to really lean on Matthew 24, and the reason is it gives greater detail. We have provided Mark 13 as well, so it's on the slides that you can look at. And there's a couple views we want to present, okay? One is Christ opens with a time period just before the tribulation. Another view, which I've seen and I like as well, is that Christ opens Matthew 24 at the beginning of the tribulation. So let's look at both of these and go from there.
Okay, let me start reading from Matthew, starting at verse 4. "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains."
And therefore, we made the green bar as the beginning of sorrows or birth pains. Depends on the translation you're reading.
Starting in Matthew 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation, and put you to death."
Then they will deliver you. There's a transition here. So they're delivering you to tribulation. And this is why we broke it, and you have this orange bar. This we know is in the beginning of the tribulation. The previous section, you're not as certain.
"And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come.
Now, isn't that interesting, Steve? Then the end will come. Here we are. We're now at the midpoint of the tribulation. Clearly, what he's saying is that last half of the tribulation is the end.
Going on from there. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the mountain top not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation.
Okay, now we know we're in the great tribulation. Because of the abomination and that statement, something's changed again. And that's something that as you're looking at these, it's important to look for those modifiers like and, then, but.
And I want to add one thing. We mentioned as we went through the Gospels in Luke, Matthew, and Mark, that one of the things that was not mentioned in Luke was the term, the abomination of desolation. But if you look at the other words in Matthew here, it really does match up with what was in Luke. That's why you have confusion.
Absolutely.
On when this was this near term or far term. So continuing on from, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go there. Or if they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it.
In Mark, is a little different. It says, because those will be the days of distress unequal from the beginning. Clearly, that's the same thing. It doesn't say tribulation, but the days of distress unequal from the beginning, there's never been a time like it, is what they're saying. That is very similar to the Great Tribulation. Daniel says it almost the same exact way. And I'm wondering if that's not why Mark picked up on that.
Now, as we go on, starting at verse 27, for as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other.
So let's examine view 2. In this view, it takes the seals of Revelation 6, which we're not going to do any analysis of. We're just going to put them where they put them. And what it does is it takes the seals and aligns them with the account of Matthew 24. If we look at the slide, the only thing that's different here is that part that we had as green called the birth pains. They moved that into the tribulation. And people have looked at this and said, when Jesus said, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. That's just like seal 1. Seal 1 is when the Antichrist comes. And you will hear of wars and rumors and wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Seal 2 is where peace is taken from the earth. And then there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these but the beginning of birth pains. Well, seal 3 is a Great Depression or famine and pestilence. And so here we are, they're saying these align exactly with it. And that's kind of interesting. The whole part there about the tribulation then is part of seal 3. And then as we come down, people equate to what is happening at the abomination. So the Antichrist is now taking power, and they're equating that to seal 4. Seal 4 is when a quarter of the world is given over to the Antichrist to control. That doesn't mean he doesn't try to control it all, but he's going out specifically to attack a quarter of the world. What we'll find out later is that quarter is really Christians. But for now, we'll leave that as it is. As you go on, seal 5 is martyrdom of the saints, and that's what the Great Tribulation is all about. And you get that because in verse 22, it talks about, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So there's great persecution going on right there. And then seal 6 is a cosmic event. And lo and behold, the words are almost exactly the same as Revelation 6 for seal 6. There's a massive cosmic event right before Christ comes.
So we're aligning right now the Gospels, but as Dale was saying, we're going to add Daniel and we're going to add Revelations in later, and you'll see how all these really line up to the same story. As a summary, Christ is clearly showing he will return after the Great Tribulation to gather his elect. Now, there's always been a question, who are these elect? But we'll get into that. And then that will be immediately preceded by a cosmic event. And that means we're not going to miss it. When he returns, we'll see it. And further, his return will be such a dramatic effect, even the unbelievers are going to know there's something coming. So just to end, to have a pre-tribulation requires 2 raptures based on what we just read. And we'll be getting into that later, but really that's one of the roadblocks we've got to get over. So what exactly is happening and who are the elect?
Okay, so now that you talk about the elect, who are the elect? Well, Paul tells us who these elect are. In Romans, he tells us that the elect are the Jews. So he says in verse 10, and not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. He was told the older will serve the younger. This is very similar to what he's talking about with Abraham. Abraham believed by faith, and that was counted to him as righteousness. So God has a purpose of election, and the Jews are elected. In Romans 11, he then talks about how the Gentiles are elected. This is verse 6, starting in 11, verse 6 through 8. If it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened? As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. He continues on a few verses later in 27 through 29. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regard to the Gospels, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So what we're seeing here is the Jews were hardened partially so that we could be brought in. In addition, as I was doing research, I found this little passage in 1 Timothy 5:21. Angels are elect as well. So in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus and of the elect angels, I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging, doing nothing from partiality. Well, who are the elect angels? They're the ones that didn't fall. Okay, we know that a portion of the angels fell.
But what you're telling me is that for the Israelites, for the Gentiles, and for the angels, the elect are really those who put their faith and trust in God.
That's what it looks like to me.
I would tend to agree based on the verses. Well, we're going to get into a little bit of, because this is a question that comes up and it affects your view on eschatology. When were the Gospels written? Now, Dale and I have talked about this. We've read different accounts. Some people put them as an early date. Other people put them like after 100 AD. But at the end of the day, they had to be written before the fall of Jerusalem. Otherwise, it would have been mentioned in the Gospels. That's a pretty important event. You know, I would think if I were Mark writing the Gospels and I wrote them in 75 AD, I would certainly have mentioned, oh, and by the way, Jerusalem has fallen just as Jesus Christ told us it would fall. But they were clearly written before this occurred, and it was still a prophecy they had not seen fulfilled.
I think the key here is how you view when these are written has an impact on how you view the end times, of whether it's already fulfilled or not.
We're going to go through one other question here. What did the early church actually teach in this respect? I'm going to reference a document called the Didache. It is also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. Now, it is not canon. It is more or less a manual that was passed around the early church on how to do things like baptism, communion, and various other practices within the young church. But in the last chapter, 16, they actually give a summary of what they viewed as the end times, which I'm going to read. Watch over your life do not let your lamps be extinguished or your body unclothed, but be ready, for you do not know the hour in which our Lord comes. Now, I want to pause here real quickly because our next section is going to be on parables, and this thing, do not let your lamps be extinguished, will fit right into that. Going on, assemble yourself together frequently to seek the things that benefit your souls, for all the time of your faith will not profit you unless you are perfect at the last. For in the last days false prophets and seducers will increase, turning the sheeps into wolves, and love will be turned into hate. For lawlessness will increase, and they will hate and persecute and betray one another. And then the deceiver of the world will appear as though he were the Son of God, and he shall do signs and wonders, and the earth shall be delivered into his hands, and he will commit immoralities which have never been done since the age began. Then shall the race of man come into the fire of proving trials, and many shall be made to stumble and perish. But those who remain established in their faith shall be saved under the very curse. And then the signs of truth shall be revealed. First, a sign spread out in the heaven, then a sign of the sound of a trumpet, and third, the resurrection of the dead. But not all the dead. But as it was said, the Lord shall come, and all his holy ones with him. Then the world will see the Lord coming in the clouds of heaven. So as you can see, not exactly like Matthew, but it follows the same theme as you go through.
So it's interesting that essentially they've got a very similar view. So now we come to a time for our brother Dave to give a short message.
Thank you, Dale and Steve. We're really starting to get into the nitty-gritty of end times prophecy now. In our previous podcasts, I've invited you, our listener, to at least align yourself with the belief that Jesus of the Bible was a real human being who literally impacted the world. And as I said before, believing in something or someone is safe and enjoyable and even entertaining. The last podcast, I shared with you an example of when belief moves into trust. And my example that I shared was the first I rode in a self-driving vehicle. Up until that point, I was entertained by the idea of self-driving vehicles, but my belief moved into trust when I got inside as a passenger and the owner told the vehicle where to drive us. And so today, I'm asking you, sit with us for a couple more podcasts and allow yourself to be open to trusting the Jesus of the Bible, who knows the future. Somehow, some way, the sections of the Bible that Steve and Dale read today describe events and circumstances that hadn't happened yet, but historically happened exactly as Jesus said they would. So what do you think? You who are listening to this podcast today, from your belief that Jesus is a real person of historic significance, can you at least sit with us for a few more episodes as Dale and Steve unpack the trustworthiness of Jesus the Christ? On several occasions, Steve and Dale encouraged you to do some study on your own with regard to the passages from the Bible that they've read or the topic that they've explored. And most importantly, we welcome you to write a comment or question anytime you listen. In our next podcast, the guys will be referencing several of the teachings of Jesus that are written down in the Bible. The relevancy of what Jesus said to our lives today helps us all move toward trust. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate that. That really hits home. That concludes our podcast. Our homework for next week are the parables. We're going to be looking at parables. We have a list here of parables to read. There's a bunch of them. The parable of the weeds, the parable of the net, the parable of the tenants, the parable of the wedding banquet, the parable of the fig trees, the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the returning owner, the parable of the watchful servants, the parable of the wise and foolish servants. Right after the parable of the returning owner and the parable of the wise and foolish servants are two little small tidbits called Not Peace But Division and Interpreting the Times. With the question of the day,
does Jesus reveal anything about the end times in the parables? And I can tell you from my own view, when I was raised in church, I never considered parables to be prophecy. But in sorting through these, clearly some of them are and relate to the end times.
I guess we're going to find out next podcast.
If
Scripture quotations are from the ESV Bible, English Standard Version, copyright 2001 by Crossway, a publishing ministry of Good News Publishers, used by permission, all rights reserved, and the NIV, the Holy Bible, New International Version, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, 2011 by Biblica Inc., used with permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Show notes and bibliography available at patient-endurance.org. Production, publishing, and editing, courtesy of Noisy Mouse Publishing.